One day, while sitting on my beanbag scrolling around YouTube, as I usually do, I found this video of Governor Chrissy Noem of South Dakota, where she is raising awareness to the so-called Marxist indoctrination that will supposedly destroy this country.
There are two things in this country that will destroy us faster than anything else. And the first one is the Marxist indoctrination that they are teaching our children in our schools.
To stop this destruction, she called upon people to support the 1776 Project, which was a report compiled by an advisor committee established by then US President Donald Trump in September 2020 that detailed, quote, patriotic education, or what she called a true and honest history.
I was the very first candidate in this entire country to sign on to the 1776 Pledge, recognizing that we needed to teach our kids true, honest history.
This report was a complete contrast to the 1619 Project, which was a long-form journalist project developed by Nicole Hannah-Jones, writers from the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, that aimed to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative. Or what Governor Naim called
that the 1619 Project, critical race theory, is hate, division, and it's not American. It's offensive. We do not have racism in our DNA in this country. We love each other, and everybody deserves to be treated equally.
Now, the discussion that Noem is highlighting is not some isolated or fringe debate, but one that is occurring all across America. This debate centers on how to teach the history of race in American classrooms.
Critical race theory is a way of thinking and teaching about America's past and present by looking at the role of systemic racism, what we've just been discussing. But the very term itself, critical race theory, has become a political flashpoint across the country.
I think there could be some things that happened in history that should have been taught.
In school, did you learn about the Tulsa Massacre?
No.
Did you learn about Juneteenth?
No.
Do you feel like those are things that should be taught as part of your formal education?
Definitely.
Jameson's mother, Vanessa, agrees.
This is American history. All of it should be taught in a certain context and also age appropriate.
Not everyone in Loudoun County sees it that way.
There were parents that were just sick of it. They were just sick of, constantly being told, if you don't agree with me, then, you're a racist. We're about teaching history in an objective way that is not represented as America is systemically racist.
Known as critical race theory, or CRT, often a graduate level framework that examines how the legacy of slavery and segregation in America is embedded in legal systems and policies. The thing is, critical race theory isn't being taught here, but that didn't stop dozens of parents from flooding a recent school board meeting to protest it.
The critical race theory has its roots in cultural Marxism. It should have no place in our schools.
The teacher's responsibility is only to teach them what's supposed to be taught in school, not their opinion.
How can educators expect to teach history accurately without talking about race and racism? How can you discuss the civil rights movement without discussing race and racism?
I will do everything I possibly can to fight to the bitter end until you prove to me that you are not teaching my children that they are racist just because they're white.
That outrage echoes messaging ricocheting across right-wing media.
Critical race theory is racist.
I don't see critical theory, race theory, in our Declaration of Independence.
Much of this can be traced back to a September 2020 directive by then-President Trump, instructing agencies to identify and halt funding of anti-bias training for federal employees that suggests, quote, the United States is an inherently racist or evil country. On his first day in office, President Biden used an executive order to revoke the Trump administration's action.
While this debate is wide-ranging and is very complicated, I believe that it is an important debate that historians should dive into. The reason why this is an important debate is because history informs people of what kind of decisions to make in not only their own personal lives, but also the public decisions we make in politics and how we interact with each other in the society we are embedded in. So for this video, I want to look at which side is right and wrong by comparing the 1776 and 1619 project, which I argue stand on different sides of this debate. Now, to review these works, we're looking at 3 criteria. 1, is it historically accurate? Which I define as a text's ability to take in context from not only current historical scholarship, but also understanding of a wider historical context as well. Number 2, is it a balanced and well thought out argument? Lastly, its writing and creative origins. So let's begin this video by taking a look at the 1776 report. First, let's look at who compiled this report. The first thing to note from the 18 members who were compiled to put this piece together was that there was no historians of US history that were asked to join it. That's not a good start for the 1776 report. Basically, if you want to talk about American history, it'd be important to actually have people who have spent their entire lives studying it, like US historians. It's almost like if you're going to have a coach for a professional football team who has never played the game at least the college level, or coach football at the professional or college. I mean, look at the resume of the current youngest coach in the NFL, Sean McVay, who was hired at the age of 30 to coach the LA Rams in 2017. Before he got the job, he spent 3 years playing college football and then spent 8 years coaching football at different levels in the NFL. In other words, there is a reason why people specialize in certain things, because they tend to be really good and well informed to talk and do those things. Like American historians are really knowledgeable about American history. That being said, at least the commission did have some scholars like Carol Miller Swain, a retired professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University. And finally, Victor David Hansen, classicist professor emeritus of classics at California State University, Fresno, the Martin and Leal Anderson Senior Fellow in Classic and Military History at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and visiting professor at Hillsdale College. Just because they are scholars, these are not the ones I would choose for this kind of project. Let's look at Carol Miller, for example. Mark Q. Sawyer, a political scientist from UCLA, reviewed her third book, The New White Nationalism in America, Its Challenge to Integration, by stating that her decision to break away from convention by drawing upon hunches and personal institution while interpreting data, frequently these hunches either led to faulty conclusions or foreclosed the opportunity for consideration of alternative explanations in this work. One can disagree with Swain's normative vision, but when that vision triumphs over social scientific evidence and fails to live up to its claims for social justice, it is legitimate to critique that vision itself. Meaning that she allows her own personal opinions to override what is supposed to be a non-biased and scientific review of the problems she examines in her work, particularly what she called the new white nationalism. This is a lesson that social scientists and historians are trained not to do, and it is figuratively beaten into them, especially once in grad school. For example, look at this comment made by my grad advisor on one sentence in my first draft of my master's thesis. He says, historians should seek neutrality and detachment. By not following this advice, you get a result that Sawyer described as, Swain raises an interesting and powerful question. Why has racism failed to disappear, and could it be getting worse? She offers little in response. Her own personal scorn for affirmative action, the black middle class, and immigrants drive the new white nationalism in America, and her apology for racist beliefs and practices. Ultimately, this book is more interesting as a testament to Swain's own peculiar politics and personal anecdotes than as a work of political science. In other words, she is a scholar who is very biased and not very good. And lastly, with Victor Hansen, it is weird that they asked a classicist, someone who studies ancient Rome or Greece, to be included in a project about American history. I mean, he could shed light on some of the elements that made up the Constitution, but if you look at his recent work regarding Trump and conservative rhetoric, it makes sense why he was chosen for this project. And for the rest of the panel, they include conservative activists and politicians who support Trump. Again, not the kind of people who are willing to be scientific in the review of history. Now that we have gone over how this document was created, let's discuss how historically accurate the report is. In its introduction, the document states, the purpose of the President's Advisory 1776 Commission is to enable a rising generation to understand the history and principles of the founding of the United States in 1776 and to strive to form a more perfect union. This requires a restoration of American education, which can only be grounded on a history of those principles that is accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling. Now, this quote may seem straightforward and harmless, but there's a lot more that meets the eye. Good history is one that is based on accurate and honest information. This because, like my professor said, historians need to be non-biased. Going further, historians need to find their history through sources. The famous Edward Hallett Carr wrote in his book, What is History? History consists of a corpus of unascertained facts. The facts are available to the historian is documents, inscription, and so on. In other words, good historians and scholars do not allow ideas such as those that are unifying, inspiring, and ennobling to override their analysis of the facts they find and decide to give meaning to. In the middle of the first page of the 1776 report, after discussing how the United States became a politically divided place, the report states, "The facts of our founding are not partisan. They are a matter of history." I mean, in a social and cultural vacuum, this statement is correct. But, as we've seen in how this document was created, this document does not deliver on following through with these principles. This perception can be seen by looking at the many faulty historical claims that the Commission makes. In this section titled, The Meaning of the Declaration, the Commission writes, like other countries, our country has borders, resources, industries, cities, and towns, farms and factories, homes, schools, and houses of worship. And although a relatively young country, its people have a shared history of common struggle and achievement, from carving communities out of a vast and untamed wilderness. Now, there is a big problem with the last part of this statement, in which it assumes that the western United States was an untamed wilderness, with no communities of people already established there, and that there was nothing but wilderness. So, are we going to forget the millions of indigenous peoples that lived on the continent, who had their own cultures, languages, and religion, and civilization, that lived in these supposedly untamed wilderness? And it was only until Americans came along, which at that time meant people of European descent, or white people, that these lands became tamed places for communities and civilization. I mean, stuff like this is like literally 1950s history. I mean, look at this 1950s history textbook from Texas, where it read, "Of course we must never forget those brave women, the wives and the mothers, who endured the hardships of the frontier to help the men carve out an entire empire of civilization amid the wilderness." Staying with this chapter, the Commission argues that some of the core elements that made up the Declaration of Independence of our country is that all men are created equal from the principle of equality. The requirement for consent naturally follows. If all men are equal, then none may by right rule another without his consent. While these qualities were stated and written by our founders in the Declaration of Independence, we must remember these words in context, and that these words were only meant for white people. Additionally, there were thousands of enslaved people of African descent who were not freed following the end of the War of Independence and continued to be enslaved. The Commission tries to resolve this contradiction in the section titled Challenges to America's Principles, or more specifically, the most common charge leveled against the founders, and hence against our country itself, is that they were hypocrites who didn't believe in their stated principles, and therefore the country they built rests on a lie. This charge is untrue and has done enormous damage, especially in recent years, with a devastating effect on our civic unity and social fabric. This statement is not only one of the main arguments that the Commission tries to support with its report, but it is also in direct conflict with the perception of the 1619 Project. So how does the 1776 Commission make their argument? Well, first they argue that slavery is not an American sin, but a sin that is a stain on human civilization in general. Or, Americans labor under the illusion that slavery was somehow a uniquely American evil. But the unfortunate fact is that the institution of slavery has been more the rule than the exception throughout human history. Of course, there is truth to this statement, but even though slavery has been a massive part of the human experience, this idea does not erase the fact that slavery is still an important part of the American origin story. The Commission then tried to soften the impact of slavery on the American origin story by stating, "It was the Western world's repudiation of slavery, only just beginning to build at the time of the American Revolution, which marked a dramatic sea change in moral sensibilities. The American founders were living on the cusp of this change in a manner that straddled two worlds. George Washington owned slaves, but came to detest the practice and wished for a plan adopted for the abolition of it. By the end of his life, he freed all his slaves in his family estate." There are several things to point out with these statements. While it is true that the abolition movements started to become more popular in the 18th century, such as the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787 in the United Kingdom, or the fact that many northern states abolished slavery after the war. However, it is important to point out that the slave trade won't end until 1807 in the United States, and the total abolition of slavery would only take place in 1865. Only Cuba and Brazil were the only westernized states to hold on to slavery longer. 1886 for Cuba and 1888 for Brazil. The Commission also attempts to purify the founders' image. They write that even though George Washington had slaves, he wished for them to be free while he was alive, and wrote in his will that he wanted his slaves to become free once he died. While it is true by the end of his life that he came to detest slavery, nothing really came out of it. In reality, in 1796, when one of his wife's slaves ran away, Washington spent the last 3 years of his life trying to force her to return. And while he wrote in his will that his slaves shall be set free after his death, he also wrote that they remain with his wife for the rest of her life. As George wrote, "Be attended by such inscrutable difficulties by their intermixture with the dour negroes," the slaves that his wife owned, "as to excite the most painful sensations to manumit them." Translation: it would be too complicated to free the enslaved people, so instead they would be owned by Martha as long as she wished, because it could cause the slaves that Martha owned to revolt. In the end, out of all the 123 slaves that George Washington owned himself, only one person was set free, shortly following his death. All the slaves were not set free until January of 1801, as historian Maria Jenkins Schwartz suggests that Martha Washington's real motivation was financial, as she felt that taking care of her husband's enslaved workers was leeching money from her children's estate. Well, this was the case, as a distressing side note, out of the 153 enslaved people that Martha had inherited, weren't so lucky. They were divvied up between her children when she died in 1802. None of Martha's children freed more than a few of the enslaved workers, or their children, during their lifetimes. And Martha never freed the single enslaved man she owned outright, even willing him to her grandson. So much for George Washington wishing for his slaves to be set free. The next founding father that the Commission tries to purify is Thomas Jefferson. When they write, Thomas Jefferson also held slaves, and yet included in his original draft of the Declaration a strong condemnation of slavery, which was removed at the insistence of certain slaveholding delegates. Inscribed in marble at his memorial in Washington, D.C., is Jefferson's foreboding reference to the injustice of slavery. "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." Well, Thomas Jefferson also wrote in 1785, when discussing the emancipation of slaves in Virginia, "To our reproach it must be said that though for a century and a half we have had under our eyes the races of black and of red men, that they have never yet been viewed by us as subjects of natural history. I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only, that blacks, whether originally a distinct race, or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to whites in the endowments both of body and mind. This unfortunate difference of color, and perhaps of faculty, is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. Among the Romans, emancipation required but one effort. The slave, when made free, might mix with, without staining the blood of his master. But with us, a second is necessary, unknown to history. When freed, he is removed beyond the reach of mixture." In other words, people of African descent are too inferior and dangerous to white people as a distinct race to be set free, as it could stain the blood of its master, or make the white race a supposedly weaker race. It is also important to point out that plantation owners like Washington and Jefferson made a lot of money from owning slaves, which will be explained in our discussion of the 1619 Project. In the end, both men were not willing to set free their slaves. To give an analogy, it's like saying I want to live a healthy life, so I will eat healthy and work out. But then, all I do is eat junk food and never work out. Does it really matter if I want to do something, but never do it? The answer is that it does not matter, and true historians only deal with things that took place. Now, the most interesting part of the Commission's defense is when they state, the foundation of our republic planted the seeds of the death of slavery in America. The Declaration's unqualified proclamation of human equality flatly contradicted the existence of human bondage, and, along with the Constitution's compromises, understood in light of that proposition, set the stage for abolition. Indeed, the movement to abolish slavery that first began in the United States led the way in bringing about the end of Abraham Lincoln's what he called legal slavery. First off, it is ironic they italicize that abolition first began in the United States. While there may be a little bit of truth in this statement, it is important to remember that the United States was one of the last countries to abolish slavery, and the United Kingdom abolished slavery in 1833. For the most part, there is truth in the statement that many abolition movements and black activists use the language of the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents and weaponize them for their political campaigns to end slavery and to bring about social equality. At the same time, it is important to point out that these words were meant for only white people and not black people, as we've seen with the actions of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, not to mention the fugitive slave laws and slave trade clause in the U.S. Constitution. Check out this video by Crash Course Black American History for more information. In other words, while this was a seed that was planted by the founders for white Americans, it had to be taken by black Americans to ensure their own freedom and prosperity. So to give an example, in Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July, a speech that he made on July 5th, 1852, to a largely white audience in Rochester, New York. But such is not the state of the case. I say with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessing in which you, this day, rejoice, are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence, bequeathed by your fathers, is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought strips and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty and unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impotence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are, to him, mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloodier than are the peoples of these United States at this very hour. That being said, black activists use the language of the Declaration to further their own cause, like Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. While the report does acknowledge the racism that continued to take place following the end of the Civil War, which gave rise to the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, it wrongly associates this racism with what is now called identity politics. As the report states, the Civil Rights Movement was almost immediately turned to programs that ran counter to the lofty ideals of the founders. The ideas that drove this change have been growing in America for decades, and they distorted many areas of policy in that half of the century that followed. Among the distortions was the abandonment of non-discrimination and equal opportunity in favor of group rights, not unlike those advanced by Calhoun and his followers. The justification for reversing the promise of colorblind civil rights was that past discrimination requires present effort, or affirmative action in the form of preferential treatment to overcome long accrued inequalities. This statement wrongly asserts that racism and affirmative action are the same thing. Now, this is a topic that is too large to explain in this video, but could be addressed in a future one. But to give a quick example, Caltech is a university that does not use affirmative action and only uses test scores as a means of judging admissions. In 2010, out of the 967 students who were admitted, only 9 black students were admitted. The reason why many students of minority parents, such as black and Latino students, do much worse on tests such as the SAT can best be described by this Vox video: Is meritocracy a myth? In the end, the 1776 Commission's report is very bad and dishonest history. To give you a visual description, now to turn to the 1619 project. Like we did with the 1776 report, let's look at how the 1619 project was put together. So the 1619 project was put together by the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, and was led by the journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones. Hannah-Jones, who is an American investigative journalist and became a staff writer for the New York Times in 2015. She also attended the University of Notre Dame, where she earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in History and African American Studies in 1998. She then graduated from the University of North Carolina Hussman's School of Journalism and Media with a master's degree in 2003, where she was a Roy H. Park Fellow. Her education background shows me that she has a basic understanding of how historical research and thinking works. At the same time, having a degree in journalism also demonstrates this idea, because historians are very similar to journalists, especially in the way they put together their writing projects. Turning to Carr again, he writes, it recalls the favorite dictum of the great liberal journalist C.P. Scott: facts are sacred, opinion is free. In spite of C.P.'s motto, every journalist known today that the most effective way to influence opinion is by the selection and arrangement of appropriate facts. It should be said that facts speak for themselves. This is of course untrue. The facts speak only when the historian calls on them. It is them who decides to which facts to give the door and in what order or context. It is within this context that makes this work good history and not great history, which I'll explain as we examine the rest of the 1619 project in depth. But back to how this project was put together. This project includes many academics and at least one historian, Kevin M. Kruse, whose research interests include the political, social, and urban-suburban history of 20th century America, with a particular focus on the making of modern conservatism. In the project, he wrote an essay called How Segregation Caused Your Traffic Jam, which details how traffic jams in places like Atlanta are created by socially constructed cultural and ethnic differences in the city and suburbs of America. Already, the project is on much more solid footing than the 1776 Commission's report. But one of the things that this project already does well is that its creators decided to fully research current debates in history that is currently being conducted by historians. The New York Times also wrote, during the early stages of development, we consulted with numerous scholars of African American history and related fields, in a group meeting at the Times as well, in a series of individual conversations. 5 of those who initially consulted with us, Marsha Bernardin of the University of California, Irvine, Matthew Desmond and Kevin M. Kruse, both of Princeton University, and Tia Miles and Kalia G. Mohammed, both of Harvard University, went on to publish articles in the issue. After those consultations, writers conducted their own research, reading widely, examining primary documents and artifacts, and interviewing historians. Finally, during the fact-checking process, our researchers carefully reviewed all the articles in the issue with subject area experts. This is no different from what we do on any article. This is unlike the 1776 report, where the only historian they reference is one from the 1920s. A historian who lived and worked in a time when society still reveled in blatant racism, and when Jim Crow was at its height in the South. By taking the approach that the 1619 project took, it is already more reflective of how current historians understand how the world we live in today came to be. In simple terms, the 1619 project is already more historically correct. That being said, there are some missteps, which I will describe in my review of the work itself. So unlike the 1776 report, the 1619 project is not one cohesive story, but a collection of stories with a central theme. The theme being how slavery and black racism has created the unequal world that we live in today. At the same time, how black people had been leading the fight to defeat this oppression, not only for themselves, but for all Americans. In order to tell the story of America, this project argues that it must be told from the point of view of when black people first came to the shore of what would be America, which is 1619. The reason being that it was the existence of black slaves and then black citizens that helped make the America we know of today and what it can be in the future. To review the story, we'll begin by looking at the introduction by Nicole Hannah-Jones called America Wasn't a Democracy Until Black Americans Made It One. Then we'll look at Matthew Desmond's essay, American Capitalism is Brutal. You can trace that to the plantation. Finally, we'll examine Kevin Kruse's essay titled, How Segregation Caused Your Traffic Jam. By taking a look at these three essays, we can rate how historically accurate this work is. Starting out with the title page of Jones's work, which states, Our founding ideals of liberty and equality were false when they were written. Black Americans fought to make them true. Without the struggle, America would have no democracy at all. I agree with this point for the most part. However, I would add that when this nation was founded, most Americans, even white Americans, could not vote. It was not until the 1820s that all white Americans could vote. In other words, democracy has not always been the democracy we associate with today. I would agree with the idea that it was not until black Americans were made full citizens following the end of the Civil War that the promise made by the founders came true. Also, it is very true that black Americans had as much of a role in this development as white Americans. Even so, as we explore in this piece, there is still much work to do. Jones's work begins by providing a short personal narrative about her own connection to the topic that she is about to discuss, which I think helps bring readers in and ties effectively into what she's about to discuss. As she gets into her talk about American history, she does a great job of discussing how black enslaved bodies were an important part of America's development into an industrialized powerhouse, with the cotton-rich South and the industrialized North. These events took place in the 19th century and helped bring America onto the world stage. At the same time, she writes, but it would be historically inaccurate to reduce the contributions of black people to the vast material wealth created by our bondage. Black Americans have also been, and continue to be, foundational to the idea of American freedom, more than any other group in this country's history. We have served generation after generation an overlooked but vital role. It is we who have been the perfecters of this democracy. I really like this statement, as black Americans have also led a vital part in creating things that many Americans cherish today, such as voting and protection rights for non-white Americans, with the 14th and 15th Amendment, but also many integral parts of American society, culture, and sciences, such as the development of jazz, producing one of America's earliest almanacs, and what may have been the country's first natively produced clock by Benjamin Banker, and many other American achievements. Now, one of the parts I have a gripe about can be found in the wording of the next paragraph. The United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie. Our Declaration of Independence, signed July 4, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain and unalienable rights. But the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness did not apply fully to 1/5 of the country, yet despite being violently denied the freedom and justice promised to all. Black Americans believe firmly in the American creed. Through centuries of black resistance and protest, we have helped the country live up to its founding ideals. I like this paragraph, except for the part where it calls the founding of our nation an idea and a lie. Now, she does explain this point, but it seems kind of weird because if our founding was a lie, then how could black Americans believe in it? It would be best to take that sentence out or replace lie and ideal with myth, because myth is a lot more neutral and less problematic term than lie. To some people, this may not be an unproblematic phrase, but to some people in the history field, this is a really awkward phrasing. In general, though, as will be seen throughout the video, these problems are significantly lesser problems than the ones found in the 1776 report. However, these are still problems for historians all the same. Nonetheless, the most controversial aspect of the 1619 project comes from the claim that the main reason why the colonists revolted against the British was because, conveniently left out of our founding mythology, is the fact that one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. By 1776, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution that had reshaped the Western Hemisphere. In London, there were growing calls to abolish the slave trade. This would have upended the economy of the colonies, in both the North and South. The wealth and promise that allowed Jefferson, at just 33, and the other founding fathers to believe they could successfully break away from one of the mightiest empires in the world came from the dizzying profits it generated by chattel slavery. In other words, we may never have revolted against Britain if its founders had not understood that slavery empowered them to do so, nor if they had not believed that independence was required in order to ensure that slavery would continue. Personally, this idea does not make sense to me. Now, there were a series of court cases in England that allowed the abolition of slavery to become a much stronger political force, like with the case of James Somerset, which made all slaves who stepped onto the British Isles a freed person. But this law only applied to Great Britain itself. If anything, some scholars have argued, like Martin McCowan, that Somerset's case was decided 36 years before Parliament prohibited the slave trade, and 62 years before it abolished slavery in the colonies, which took place in 1834. Its importance, as Binman and Lesser have observed, has been vastly exaggerated. In essence, slavery had not been proscribed, but its continued existence had been allowed in annotated form, and only the worst abuse, the forcible removal of Negroes back to the colonies, rendered unequivocally unlawful despite the fact that it undoubtedly continued. In other words, slavery was not halted, but slightly changed, especially in the British colonies, meaning that it is hard to believe that the founders thought that the British were on the verge of getting rid of slavery, which would mean that there was less a chance that one of the main reasons for independence would be the keeping of slavery. That being said, there have been some interesting responses from historians. A group of American historians signed to a letter from the website of the Committee of the Fourth International. On the American Revolution, pivotal to any account of our history, Project asserts that the founders declared the colonies' independence of Britain in order to ensure slavery would continue. This is not true. If supportable, the allegation would be astounding. Yet, every statement offered by the project to validate it is false. At the same time, the historian Alex Lichtenstein wrote in his response to letter writers and the 1619 Project, admittedly, at a minimum, her formulation seriously overstates the anti-slavery bona fides of the British Empire at the time, not to mention the universality of pro-slavery views in the colonies. Fair enough. So then, what would suffice in its stead? One of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence? How about some of the patriots fought for independence in the knowledge that it would secure their investments in slavery? Presumably, at least some of the letter writers would find the following counterformulation no less objectionable. There are many reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence, but the preservation of slavery was not among them. While Hannah-Jones may be guilty of overstatement, this is more a matter of emphasis than it is of a correct or incorrect interpretation. I am more in line with Lichtenstein's point of view on this discussion, in that I do not think her point cannot be technically wrong, but that it needs some adjusting. And to the New York Times' credit, they changed the wording to some want independence to keep slavery, which is definitely a historical possibility. It is these kind of problems that plague this essay that Lichtenstein explains as disputable errors or perhaps overstatements, which means that these are the kind of problems that historians debate about all the time, and not the same kind of problems that are included in the 1776's report. If anything, these are good problems to have. At the same time, I agree with Lichtenstein when he says, even if bolstered by what the letter refers to as verifiable fact, that's not much on which to rest a dismissal of the entire project. In other words, there's a lot of good stuff here. In Matthew Desmond's essay, American Capitalism is Brutal, you can trace that to the plantation. He explains in great detail how important slavery was to the economic explosion that took place in the 19th century United States, and how it also helped Britain during the Industrial Revolution. At the same time, he shows that slavery became an industrial project in its own right. However, I do wish he would have acknowledged how capitalism in general, as seen in Europe, which have also contributed to the brutality of American capitalism. And the last essay I would like to discuss is Dr. Kevin Krus's essay titled How Segregation Caused Your Traffic Jam. In this essay, Krus demonstrates that after the abolition of slavery, cities in many places, including outside of the Jim Crow South, that, once they had no need to keep constant watch over African Americans, whites wanted them out of sight. Civic planners pushed them into ghettos, and segregation as we know today became the rule. This was done through a multitude of ways. At first, the rule was overt, as southern cities like Baltimore and Louisville enacted laws that mandated residential racial segregation. Such laws were eventually invalidated by the Supreme Court, but later measures achieved the same effect by more subtle means. During the New Deal, federal agencies like the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration encouraged redlining practices that explicitly marked minority neighborhoods as risky investments and therefore discouraged bank loan mortgages and insurance there. Other policies simply targeted black communities for isolation and demolition. These factors were made worse by the fact that black Americans who were forced into these places were targeted for so-called urban renewal and were usually forced to leave their homes on a regular basis. Now, what does this have to do with traffic? Well, Cruz explains that roads, and especially highways, were used as not only borders between white and minority communities, but they're also used to destroy minority communities as well. For example, in Atlanta, the intent to segregate was crystal clear. Interstate 20, the east-west corridor that connects I-75 with I-85 in Atlanta Center, was deliberately plotted along a winding route in the late 1950s to serve, in the words of Mayor Bill Hartsfield, as the boundary between the white and Negro communities. On the west side of the town, black neighborhoods, he hoped, would be hemmed in on one side of the new expressway, while white neighborhoods on the other side of it will be protected. Racial residential patterns have long since changed, of course, but the awkward path of I-20 remains in place. As white Americans began to move into the suburbs in droves in the 60s and 70s, this meant that there were a lot more people coming into the city through the highway system, meaning a lot more traffic. The good thing is that mass transportation, such as buses and trains, could help solve this problem. Except this has not happened. In Atlanta, for example, residents of the nearly all-white Cobb County resoundingly rejected the new system. David Chestnut, the white chairman of MARTA, insisted in 1987 that suburban opposition to mass transit had been 90% a racial issue. Because of that resistance, MARTA became a city-only service that did little to relieve commuter traffic. By the mid-1980s, white racists were joking that MARTA, with its heavily black ridership, stood for moving Africans rapidly through Atlanta. Even as the suburbs became more racially diverse, they remained opposed to MARTA. After Gwynwitt voted the system down again in 1990, a former Republican legislator later marveled at the arguments given by the opponents. They will come up with 12 different ways of saying they are not racist in public, he told a reporter. But you get them alone behind a closed door, you see this old blatant racism that we have had here for quite some time. By taking this position, Krauss is arguing that one of the reasons why traffic is so bad in metropolises all across the United States, such as in Atlanta, is because of the way in which people view black people in these cities, which has made up most of the population in these cities. It is here that we see another way in which the issue of race has impacted our world more deeply than what can be seen on the surface. In the end, what was stated in this work is not shocking to someone like me who has studied history at a high level. In the words of Lichtenstein, in fact, many scholars initially greeted 1619 with excitement and effusive praise. In part, I suspect that this was because the basic impulse behind the collection of 18 articles and many additional short essays by journalists, historians, sociologists, poets, legal scholars, English professors, artists, playwrights, and novelists reflects how many, if not most, American historians already teach about that past in the undergraduate classroom. Speaking for myself, for 3 decades, now I have emphasized in my U.S. survey class that the African American experience must be considered central to every aspect of American history. You cannot understand anything about the latter, I inform my students, unless you incorporate the former into the narrative. Yes, that includes the revolution and the founding of the nation. If anything, scholars have been talking amongst themselves with this lens for many years, even before this document came into existence. I would also like to add to the problems that lie within the 1619 project are problems that historians discuss with each other on a daily basis. The New York Times' response to the outrage to its project put it best by saying, "As the five-letter writers well know, there are often debates, even among subject area experts, about how to see the past. Historical understanding is not fixed. It is constantly being adjusted by new scholarship and new voices. Within the world of academic history, differing views exist, if not over what precisely happened, then about why it happened, who made it happen, and how to interpret the motivations of historical actors and what it all means." While this is the case, there are limits as to what constitutes a legitimate historical debate. The 1619 Project falls within these limits. On the other hand, the 1776 report does not fall within these parameters. This is because it totally ignores current historical research and did not invite any current historical scholars to work on the report. At the same time, the 1776 report and its creators were totally biased and non-scientific in their review of history. Also, to return to how we started this video, if the 1619 Project was a Marxist creation, as Governor Kristi Noem stated, then why would the Fourth International website responded to this project by writing, "We are dismayed at some of the factual errors in the project and the close process behind it. These errors, which concern major events, cannot be described as interpretations or framing. They are matters of verifiable fact, which are the foundation of both honest scholarship and honest journalism. They suggest a displacement of historical understanding by ideology, dismissal of objections on racial groups, that they are the objections of only white historians, has affirmed that displacement." So much for the 1619 Project being a work of Marxist ideology. In conclusion, the 1619 Project is a much more superior work of history than the 1776 report. It is not even close. Thank you.